Welcome back to Mastering 3D in Photoshop. My name is Kirk Nelson, and we are working our way through Chapter 1, which is the 3D compositing chapter of the course. We find ourselves now on lesson number 4, where we talk about positioning and transforming. So here we are back in Photoshop, and in the course files for this lesson, you will find this image here called basesetting.jpg. And when we discuss transforming and positioning, what we're talking about is getting a 3D imported model to fit within this scene so it looks like it's part of the photograph. Now you're probably thinking, oh, this is easy. I can just take the scene and then do the import 3D file like we did before. Well, let me walk you through some of the problems that sometimes you'll run into with doing that. We'll try that. Let's go to 3D, new 3D file, new 3D layer from file, like we did before, and we'll use that same Jeep model that we had previously. I'm going to set the inches down fairly low on the 3D units, switch to the 3D workspace, and then it looks like it comes in fairly okay. It looks nice and clean. But the problem that a lot of times we run into with these type of situations is that we can't get the shadows to line up, because it turns out that the ground plane that Photoshop interprets for this model is different from the shadow catching ground plane that's built into the model. Now, I know that sounded a little bit confusing. First, let's try scaling this down and making it fit within our scene first. So just very roughly, I'm going to show some of the issues that we can have with this. It fits in there somewhat, but where are the shadows? And see, that is the crux of the problem with using some of these 3D imported models. So to try to find that shadow, let's start moving the light around. Do you see something floating up there in the sky? You see that? That's actually the shadow that's supposed to be on the ground. See if I can get it to be a little more obvious. There it is. Oh, you see it? There's the shadow. Now this doesn't work. Not at all. Because it's all upside down. It's flipped over. We can try to flip the entire scene over, but really it's very difficult to resolve something like this. So what I'm going to show you is a better workaround to this method. So I'm going to start back fresh from our basesetting.jpg again. This time I'm going to add a blank layer, just a new layer that's completely blank. And then from the 3D panel, I will create a new mesh from preset, and I'm going to use a cube. So now we have this cube sitting right here in our scene. Notice that the ground shadow actually works with this. And for incorporating a 3D object into a photograph, that really is a critical aspect. You got to make sure that the shadows work. And if you can't use the built-in ground plane shadow catcher, which is what this is, it does become very, very difficult to create a seamless composition. Now for the time being, I just want to scale this cube down just to make it so it's not quite so big and in my way, because the first thing I want to do is get this built-in ground plane to match the perspective of the ground that's in the photo. And here's a great trick for working on that. First of all, we'll go to File, File Info. And in this window, go to the camera data, and you'll notice the focal length here. Now this shows the type of camera that took this photo, image size, the resolution, and most importantly, it's this focal length, 40 millimeters. That's important because now we can come over to our digital camera or our synthetic 3D camera, and we can change the focal length here to match. That is going to make it much easier to try to line things up within our scene. So now fortunately, we have some advantages here with this scene because this road contains some straight lines that we can try to match our ground plane up to. And then once you have those lines fairly well lined up, you can see how well dialing in that focal length really helped out with coordinating the ground planes in here. Now it's not going to look completely perfect, and that's because the actual ground isn't a flat plane. It's a mountainous landscape. You can see that. There's some hills, there's some inclines, there's some slopes going on, and we can't mimic that with a flat plane. But this comes really close to matching at least the flat area of this road, which is what we're mostly concerned about. Now, if you want to mimic the camera position that I have here, here's the coordinates for it. And so now our task is to position this cube on that road. We'll pick the cube from the 3D panel. You'll notice in the properties panel for it, there's this move to ground button. Now this is also found in the 3D menu, Move Objects to Ground Plane, which snaps that 3D mesh to the ground plane. And then we can move it according to the move widgets that's available for us on screen, or you can use the coordinates panel. Now when we get this to a position that we like, now let's try to match up the lighting just roughly right now. So we'll pick the infinite light here, and we'll use the on-screen positioning to rotate that over till it looks like it matches roughly with the shadows that we see in the scene. And while that shadow appears to match up angle-wise, it's not quite dark enough to really match. And that's because in the environment setting, the ground plane shadows by default are set to a 60% opacity. Let's go ahead and put those up to a full 100%. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, great. We have a cube sitting on this road in this mountainous landscape. How is this helpful? This cube is just a stand-in for that Jeep model. We really just wanted to use it because it makes it simple to do things like position the ground plane to fit and get the lighting angled in and dialed in correctly. And it's actually much faster than if the computer has to deal with a heavy and detailed model. It's just a cube. So what we'll do now is go over here to the 3D panel. If you're on the cube line, use this flyout menu here to select Replace Mesh. And now is when we pick that Jeep Wrangler 3D model. And then Photoshop replaces that cube with a Jeep that sits on its back end. Look like it's facing straight up to the sky. So clearly the angling is not correct, but look, there's a ground shadow. We've solved the issue of no shadow on this model. But we did lose the actual positioning, and there's going to be some issues with texturing later on, but those are a little bit easier to deal with. For right now, let's start positioning this guy in here so that he looks like he's actually on the road. And we get to a point that he looks like about the right area here. Remember, you can still use the Move to Ground button to pop him right down on the road there. Now, sometimes the scaling can be a little strange on these models. If you run into some weird anomalies with the scaling with the widget here, you can go up and use the scaling within the coordinates panel. And the best way to do that is to change the coordinates from dimensions to scale. Now, when you do adjust the scale, it scales from the center of the model, which means you then have to readjust the position to make it on that ground plane. Something that I really like to do when I'm compositing vehicles into a scene is after I've positioned it and scaled it and gotten it exactly where I want and hit that Move to Ground plane, is I usually lower it just ever so slightly through the ground plane. And the reason I do that is because actual cars, when they sit on their tires, like they all would do, the bottom of the tire bulges a little bit and actually has a flat area on the bottom where it meets the road. Now, traditionally, 3D models don't include this. In fact, we'll move this back to the ground plane. You can see it's a perfectly round area that sits right there and makes just a tangential contact with the road. That's not what you want. It's a subtle thing that will look really unrealistic, and it's one of those things that you're not certain why it looks so strange. And that's mostly because the car is on too perfect of tires. So I always move it down just so slightly so that I can later on make sure that there's a flat area on the render so it looks a little bit more realistic. So from here, we're pretty much done with this positioning. Now, if you want, you can create a selection and you can render this in just to see how that's going to look. All right, guys, there we go. We've got a Jeep imported 3D object fit into a mountainous scene from a photograph. That brings us to an end of lesson number 4. Now in our next lesson, lesson number 5, we'll deal with the lighting and the texturing of this model so it looks a lot more realistic and not like some molded clay Jeep that's sitting there on our mountain scene.